Hey everyone, it is Friday, and that means it is time for me to bring you guys another MTG Top 10. This week, as you can see, I'm looking at the top 10 cards featuring or referencing Chandra. This is another list based on how powerful the cards are, and especially based on how well they did on the Magic tournament scene. This is probably what the majority of my lists are, but not all of them. Before we get into the list, I do want to remind you guys that I have a Patreon, and if you'd like to help me make my channel even better, that's one way you can. Anyway, first let me explain why it is I decided to do a top 10 on Chandra this week. So if you didn't know, last week Wizards announced what the next block will be, and we'll be traveling to Chandra's home plane of Kaladesh. We've only seen glimpses of Kaladesh in the past, most especially in Magic Origins, and now we will spend a whole block there. The set is expected to be released on September 30th, 2016, and promotional material for the set, especially the Planeswalker packs, which are going to be the new replacement for the intro packs, feature Chandra on them prominently. I think it is safe to say that Chandra will at least appear in Kaladesh, or at least in the Kaladesh block, especially because the plan right now seems to be to include at least one person from the Gatewatch in every set, and Chandra is who makes the most sense on her home plane. So, anticipating that we see way more cards that will feature or reference Chandra, I think it would be a good time to look at the top 10 cards featuring Chandra in Magic's history. By featuring Chandra, I mean a number of things. It can be that the card actually has Chandra in the art, or it can be that Chandra is referenced in the name of the card or in the flavor text. It could also be a card that represents an important part of Chandra's story. It will all make more sense as we get into the list. One requirement, though, is that Chandra has to be on the original art or involved somehow in the original incarnation of the card. So that means, for example, the dual decks version of Incinerate that you see here doesn't count, as Incinerate's a very old card who does have a very good history in Magic, but it did not originally have Chandra on it, so it does not make the list. So let's begin with an honorable mention. As an honorable mention, we have a card that represents Chandra herself, and indeed it is an important card flavor-wise because it represents the moment she became a Planeswalker. This card is panned by many as the worst of the Origins Flipwalker cycle, and they are right, I think. That said, though, it isn't like she never showed up anywhere competitively. Right when Magic Origins came out, Red Deck Wins decks were very popular in Standard, making lots of good appearances, and Chandra was a part of some of those decks. She didn't appear in all of them, and she frequently only showed up in the sideboard for grindier matchups. She was in the sideboard of the deck that won Pro Tour Magic Origins in 2015, and she appeared in several incarnations of Red Deck Wins for a few months in 2015 that did well at Star City Games tournaments as well. But she does have the weakest resume not only of all the Flipwalkers, but she also has a weak resume for a Chandra card, so she doesn't quite make it to the top 10. There is some chance that she makes a showing at some point in Standard, but she doesn't have a whole lot more time, and she would be good in any sort of burn deck that might emerge, at least as a sideboard card. That said, it is the first card to have Kaladesh in its name, and now we're going there for a full block, so it fits into this list pretty well. Anyway, let's move on to the actual top 10. I'm doing something a little different this time. As you can see to the left there, I sort of have the resume of the individual card. I'll talk specifically about where these Pro Tour top 8s, which you can see two of here, appeared. So just to let you know, you'll be seeing that on all future videos like this and on this video as well. Let me know what you think about that in the comments, but I thought it would sort of visualize in a better way what I'm talking about. So as you can see at number 10, I have a card that could very well move further up on the list before it rotates out of Standard, Pyromancer's Goggles. It was printed in Magic Origins, and this is a card that represents a key part of Chandra's wardrobe, and she's quoted in the flavor text. There she mentions Jaya Ballard, a pyromancer who lived well before Chandra did, but who founded an important academy for pyromancers on the plane of Regatha, where Chandra herself actually went to perfect her abilities. Chandra, one way or another, ended up with these goggles that used to belong to Jaya, and she wears those goggles in most depictions of her. This card is the namesake of a deck doing very well in Standard right this moment that focuses on ramping up to big spells and copying them, including X spells, to win the game. The deck hasn't been around for a super long time, so it hasn't had the time to build a huge resume, but it did appear in two decks in the top 8 of the most recent Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. The deck is considered Tier 1 in Standard right now, and if it stays at that level, it can end up with a lot more than 2 top 8s at big events before all is said and done. So, from an accessory that used to belong to Jaya Ballard, we move to actual Jaya Ballard. This is the oldest card that will appear on this list, having been originally printed way back in Time Spiral, and her connection to Chandra is admittedly somewhat tenuous. But as I just explained, Chandra did indirectly learn a lot about being a pyromancer from Jaya Ballard, since her academy for pyromancers helped educate Chandra. Plus, Chandra totally stole a key part of Jaya's look, those goggles. Jaya Ballard is a strong card because she can do so many different things. Each of her abilities is very flavorful too because each is meant to represent a famous card from Magic's past. The first is Red Elemental Blast, the second is Incinerate, and the third is Inferno. Jaya did not see much play when she was originally printed, but a card would be printed that would make her pretty incredible a few years later, Painter's Servant. This is a card that makes all cards everywhere a color chosen by the painter's controller. This means that Jaya could use her Elemental Blast ability against any permanent, making her pretty powerful. These painters' decks didn't rely on Jaya Ballard to win, they primarily tried to win with Grindstone, but Jaya Ballard was usually in this deck either in the main board or the sideboard because she provided a very efficient form of removal. Jaya Ballard appeared in a string of Legacy top 8s, at Grand Prix Amsterdam in 2011, Grand Prix Strasbourg in 2013, and at Grand Prix Paris in 2014. She's still showing up some in Legacy, and she appeared in a painter deck that won an SCG Legacy event in 2015, so she isn't quite done yet, but it has been a while since she had a high finish at a Grand Prix. But she does have 3 Grand Prix top 8s under her belt, which she actually wears a belt in the arts. How about that? So on to number 8. And that's where we have Flames of the Firebrand. I considered not including this card, as it is a functional reprint of Arc Lightning, which existed well before Chandra ever did, but it doesn't have the same name, so in the end I decided to include it. It also has some sweet art. Obviously it's a good spell. Anytime an effect like this is in Standard, it at least sees play in sideboards, because it can 3-for-1 some aggro decks in most formats, and when Flames of the Firebrand was in Standard, it saw some play. It first showed up on the competitive scene when it finished in the top 4 of the World Magic Cup in 2012, and it showed up in a deck that mostly focused on zombie synergies, but it was a black-red deck, and this card was good enough in the metagame that it showed up as a singleton main board with one in the sideboard as well. It continued to see play in 2012, showing up in the top 8 of Grand Prix Nagoya, and it also did well at Pro Tour Theros in Dublin in 2013. In addition to these premier play appearances, it also showed up in several decks that did well at Star City Games events in 2012 and 2013. So at number 7, we have, surprise, another burn spell. Turns out Chandra is on a lot of burn spells, which is probably what you should expect. This one is pretty unique, though. Not a functional reprint like the one we just looked at. Exquisite Firecraft, which is printed in Magic Origins. It appeared in a lot of the same decks that Chandra Fire of Kaladesh did, right when Magic Origins came into Standard, but it appeared in a lot more decks than Flipwalker Chandra did, with 3 decks in the top 8 at Pro Tour Magic Origins in 2015, packing multiple copies of the card. It also appeared in the top 8 of the World Magic Cup in 2015, as well as about a dozen Star City Game Open events. I'm a little surprised the card hasn't seen a little bit more play, and if you follow my other content, you know I recently featured it in a blue-red burn deck in Standard that does a pretty good job against Tier 1 decks, so it may not quite be done yet, but for now it sits at number 7 with its 3 Pro Tour top 8s all at the very same Pro Tour. So from there we go to number 6, and we don't have a card that directly features Chandra, but it is her parents, and one of the most complete looks we've also gotten at the plane of Kaladesh. You know, the background and the art shows us a lot about Kaladesh, shows Indian influence, shows thopters flying everywhere. We also knew from cards set in Kaladesh in general, there's going to be a lot of thopters coming our way, and Pia and Karan Nalar sort of embody that. Chandra's parents were very important to her, and their death is what led to her Planeswalker Spark igniting, so they are obviously very important to Chandra. Also, they are a really good card, and because of that, they have appeared in tons of decks that have done well at high-level tournaments. 4 mana for 4 power, 2 of which have flying, and the ability to hurl artifacts is pretty great, and it makes point removal spells pretty bad. So Chandra's parents tend to show up in any standard metagame, packing a lot of point removal and not much in the way of board sweepers. That means right now they aren't making a lot of noise in a world with Languish and Radiant Flames running around, but they could be back. They first came onto the scene at Pro Tour, the first Pro Tour after Origins, Pro Tour Magic Origins, where they appeared in the blue-red artifact deck that ran Ensoul Artifact and did very well at the tournament, finishing in the top 8. After Ensoul Artifact rotated out of Standard, they didn't disappear though, and they began to appear in various control decks as important finishers, appearing in the top 8 of a Jeskai midrange deck at Grand Prix Quebec City in 2015, and in a Grixis control deck at Grand Prix Pittsburgh that also finished in the top 8. They also made tons of appearances at the World Magic Cup in 2015, with 4 decks in the top 8 running Chandra's parents. Their success has carried into 2016, with 2 control decks at Grand Prix Oakland in 2016 featuring Pia and Karan. They're so good that they've even shown up in some top-tier modern decks, such as Jund and Blue Moon, but those decks haven't had a high finish just yet in Pro Tours or Grand Prix. I guess they never will have a high finish in a Pro Tour in Modern, since Modern Pro Tours are over, but they could show up in some Grand Prix in the future. So next we have number 5, where we have Chandra Flamecaller. From after this, there's a pretty huge gap in performance. Cards I'm talking about right now have appeared a few times in top 8s. From here on, they'll appear in a lot, but I think Chandra Flamecaller, when she's done, probably will also be in the group of appearing in a lot. And that's because Chandra Flamecaller is really good. She's one of the best planeswalkers in Standard right now, and she appears in a variety of decks, including Goggles decks and other ramp decks, as well as a finisher in several control decks. She has several powerful effects, especially her board sweeping ability and the ability to put elementals into play. Her zero effect sometimes draws you cards, and if they print more good cards with Madness, it could get even better. While she appeared in several decks at Star City Games events in the Magic Online Championship Series in early 2016, she started to appear with regularity at premier events, starting with Grand Prix Houston in 2016, where she was in the top 8. 3 decks featuring Chandra appeared in the top 8 of Grand Prix Paris 2016, and 3 decks running Chandra appeared in the top 8 of the Magic Online Standard Championship. She has plenty of time to beef up her resume too, since she was only recently printed, and she probably will in the future, as she appears in a lot of decks in Standard right now. But for now, she sits at number 5. So for there, we go to number 4, where we have Chandra's Phoenix, a card where Chandra is referenced both by name and by the art, and sort of by the card itself, which is a 3-mana 2/2 creature with haste and flying that comes back from your graveyard into your hand whenever a red instant or sorcery or planeswalker deals damage to an opponent. Obviously, that's there for flavor. It would be pretty bad if a card named Chandra's Phoenix did not come back to your hand when you damaged them with Chandra. This card has had a lot of successes in Standard, and it was in Standard for a while because it was printed in both M12 and M14. It first broke onto the scene in 2011 at Grand Prix Pittsburgh, appearing in 2 top 8 decks lists in another variant of Red Deck Wins. Red Deck Wins, anytime it's good, it just so happens that there's good Chandra cards around too, which kind of makes sense. It also appeared in a Red Deck Wins deck that finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Hiroshima that same year. After it was printed again in M14, it made some more impressive appearances in a burn deck that finished in the top 8 of Grand Prix Calgary and in a top 8 deck at Grand Prix Dallas-Fort Worth. It continued to be good in 2014, where it racked up 3 top 8 finishes at Grand Prix Beijing and in the deck that won Grand Prix Moscow. After not having a high finish in a Pro Tour ever, it finally broke through with a top 8 at Pro Tour Magic 2015. If the Phoenix ever gets reprinted, and I guess it's a possibility in Kaladesh, you can bet it'll probably get some more good finishes, as it begs to be put in any aggressive red deck, especially burn decks. So, at number 3, we have a common. Most of the cards on this list so far have either been rares or mythics. I think there's been one uncommon. But at number 4, we have a common that has been a staple for red decks in Standard ever since it was printed, Fiery Impulse. Here we see Chandra in her youth using her Pyromancer abilities to fight some automatons, which gives us another good look at the world of Kaladesh, where there are tons of artifacts like these particular automatons. A card that does 2 damage for 1 mana is almost always going to show up in Standard decks, and the fact that this can sometimes get to 3 damage makes it even better. Cards like this are cheap and efficient enough that even aggro decks run them to burn blockers out of the way, and control decks run them for being cheap removal. As a result, it has a pretty impressive resume, probably one of the better ones that any common Standard has right now. Fiery Impulse appeared just as early as it could at Pro Tour Magic Origins, where a playset were in Red Deck Wins deck that won it all. But it doesn't stop there. Fiery Impulse stuck around for Pro Tour Battle of Zendikar, where it was in 5 of the top 8 decks in the tournament. After that, it showed up at Grand Prix Quebec City in 2015, where it was in 4 of the top 8 decks, and it also appeared in the top 8 at Grand Prix Brussels in 2015, and several decks in the top 8 of the World Magic Cup in 2015. It continued to show up regularly in decks in 2016, too, appearing in 3 of the top 8 decks at Grand Prix Oakland in 2016, and 2 of the top 8 decks at Grand Prix Houston in 2016, and 3 of the top 8 decks at Grand Prix Paris in the same year. More recently, it is being played in the decks that run Pyromancer's Goggles, which is a flavor win, and thus it appeared in 2 of the top 8 decks at Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. It also has 2 top 8 finishes at Grand Prix Toronto, 3 at Grand Prix New York, and 2 at Grand Prix Tokyo. It's a resume that is very long that indicates how much of a staple the card is right now, and it'll probably rack up a few more appearances before it rotates out. There just isn't a more efficient red removal spell in the format, or maybe even any kind of removal spell in the format. So it's going to make some more good appearances, but it already has a very impressive resume, and, it's a common, so a very impressive one, though. So from there, we go to number 2, and we're nearing the end of our list, and you may have noticed that there's a serious lack of Planeswalkers on this list, especially for a list that's about a Planeswalker. Well, it turns out most Chandra Planeswalkers never did a whole lot on the competitive scene. We saw that the Flipwalker Chandra made a few small appearances, and we know that Chandra Flamecaller is very good, the one in Standard right now, but most of the others have not been especially good. However, Chandra Flamecaller isn't the first really good card depicting Chandra as a Planeswalker. The first one was Chandra Pyromancer. It was printed first in M14 and again in M15, meaning that was in standard for a pretty long time, allowing it to compile quite the resume. This Chandra is very good because she has a relatively low converted mana cost for a Planeswalker, and she has a good ability that damages the opponent while also allowing you to keep a creature from blocking or even kill it. She can also draw you extra cards, the way that red cards draw extra cards anyway, in that it exiles the card, and if you can play it that turn, then you get to play it. This Chandra had several impressive appearances. 2013 was a good year for the Chandra, especially it first showed up in the top 8 at Grand Prix Detroit in that year in a Jund deck, and it also appeared in the top 8 of Pro Tour Theros, Grand Prix Santiago, Grand Prix Albuquerque, and in 2 decks at Grand Prix Vienna and 2 at Grand Prix Dallas-Fort Worth. But it didn't stop once 2014 came around, where it appeared in top 8 deck lists at Grand Prix Buenos Aires, Grand Prix Phoenix, Grand Prix Minneapolis, and Grand Prix Boston, eventually culminating with an impressive showing at Pro Tour Magic 2015, appearing in 2 of the top 8 deck lists. Its success continued as long as it was in Standard, and as you can see, Chandra Pyromancer appeared in an amazing 19 Grand Prix top 8 deck lists in Standard before it rotated out. That's an impressive resume, so what could possibly beat that? Well, young Pyromancer can. Now, this card admittedly, of all the cards on this list, has the weakest direct connection to Chandra. She isn't in the art of the card, not clearly anyway, more on that in a moment. She isn't directly mentioned in the flavor text, and this person has nothing to do with Chandra as far as her own personal history. But the card itself pays huge homage to Chandra in a lot of ways. The best way to explain this is to begin with the flavor text, which reads, "Immolation is the sincerest form of flattery." This calls our attention to the fact that the Pyromancer pictured in the art for this card is actually trying to imitate Chandra, from having what appears to be badly dyed red hair to wearing similar clothing, and even having a pendant on that seems to have a picture of Chandra on it, which you can see just to the right of the card there. Basically, this guy is a Chandra fanboy, Chandra's biggest fan. From a sort of humble concept, though, this card has actually been very impressive. In fact, I think beating out any card that actually has Chandra on it. Why, you ask? Well, because young Pyromancer didn't only have success in Standard, like most of the cards on this list, and actually, he really didn't do much in Standard, comparatively. But he's a huge part of lots of the Eternal formats. He's a huge part of Blue-Red Delver decks in Modern, and he's also shown up in Delver decks in Legacy and Vintage. He is great because he gives you a decent body for 2 mana, but once you stick one in play, you can continue playing your game, that is, burning your opponent's creatures and countering their spells, and this guy slowly builds up an army for you, giving you a ridiculous amount of value. This card is actually, I think, one of the best 2-drops in Modern, and keep in mind that is a Modern that also has Tarmogoyf. Let me give you a rundown of its impressive resume, which you can also see as a summary to the left of the card. He first burst on the competitive scene in Standard in 2014 in a deck that won Grand Prix Moscow that year. He also managed a top 8 at Pro Tour Magic 2015. His next big appearances were actually in Legacy, where he appeared in a deck that won Grand Prix Edison that same year, as well as in another deck within the top 8. He wasn't done doing well in multiple formats, though, and he appeared in the deck that won Grand Prix Madrid in 2014, which was a Modern Grand Prix. He would also have some impressive finishes in 2015, such as in 2 decks in the top 8 at Grand Prix Omaha, and a top 8 finish at Grand Prix Kyoto. No Vintage, you say? Well, young Pyromancer would do well in Vintage in 2015 too, appearing in 2 decks in the top 8 of Grand Prix Las Vegas. He would continue to show up, most in Modern though, with a top 8 at Grand Prix Copenhagen that same year, and in the top 8 of the 2015 World Championship. Legacy did continue to be a good environment for Chandra's biggest fan, though, with 2 top 8 finishes at Grand Prix Seattle Tacoma in 2015. Now, in terms of raw numbers, the Pyromancer's resume isn't quite as strong as Chandra Pyromancer. But the fact that he finished in the top 8 of major tournaments in all 4 of Magic's major formats, Standard, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, makes this guy the winner in my book, especially because he is definitely not done putting up impressive finishes in the Eternal formats. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. What did you think of the list? Is there any important Chandra card that I left out? Did I overrate any of them? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to also like and subscribe.